was it Hart maybe you quoted, who said that there is this idea that you can like, or they say somewhere you can read like any chapter in any order you want, but it's like it's maybe first after you have read it once that you can start to do it. That it's a whole, and then you have to. But when you have like seen the whole, then you are able to navigate it much better.
Oh, that's very true. I think a lot of people who want to only have to read it once will cheat and just read the conclusion first. Because I think if you read the conclusion first, it can be easier to try to piece together all the different plateaus. But I'm not sure how much sense the conclusion makes without reading the various parts first.
I thought about it when I was reading the conclusion, was that how would I have read this if I had started with this?
Yeah.
Would that have changed my reading? Because there's so much clarity in the end. But then I was thinking, like, is this also clear because I know the rest?
Right.
Is that why it's so clear? So, because I see it, I sense it, that it's so interesting because the conclusion could be the introduction. The conclusion is like the introduction. So I think it's written so that there are two openings. It's open to the back and open in the front. So there is like multiple ways in it, and it seemed like a perfect introduction, but it's written like this conclusion, because yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, like, isn't there somebody who says that you should always read the conclusion of a book first and the introduction last? I've heard that before. I'm not sure how well that works in this case. Reading the rhizome last and the conclusion first. It could work. It probably wouldn't. It probably wouldn't be that strange to do, but yeah, the conclusion really ties everything together, and it's written very similar to, I think, his book, one of his Spinoza books, the shorter one, where it's just almost a dictionary. It does a good job of bringing forward the major concepts that they've created or drawn upon, and presenting them in almost a systematic way, as systematic as this book can get.
I really loved, the little figures, the numbers on the left. That there is this this very strange way of referencing yourself. That this is like, and I tried to follow those numbers up, because I suppose there are chapters or plateaus that they're referencing. I couldn't really get it, but it's like, and when you read it, then you see like how rhizomatic the text in itself is, because he does all these zigzagging references in the end, showing how, like it's just 4, 6, 7, 9 in one line. So it like shows this rhizomatic nature of the whole text that you have been reading, that is like very, very zigzaggy, and it does it very good in the end, like with those little numbers. They have a little twist to it. I don't know, shall we start with some questions, or shall I?
If you have something to say, you can dive right into it.
I have this model in my head that I have been working with. If we're jumping straight into a little kind of meta discussion about the whole text, how and what I have learned is that when I look back at it now, I finished it a couple of days ago, so I have thought about it, and I see the whole 1,000 plateau now as some kind of singularity in itself. And in the introduction, it talks about books can be trees, and most books are trees. But this, I don't know if it says like this, but this book is a rhizome. This book is not a tree, it's a rhizome. And it's a literary experiment. How can a book be something, not be a tree, but be a rhizome? And I think that he's actually, the whole book in itself is proving this point. The book in itself is rhizomatic. And when I was reading, because last time Julian said that this is hard to read, and he says one thing and then he says it again, and then you said like this, you have talked about this in another chapter, so why do you take this up again? So and then you said like, is there because it doesn't have editor or something? But I think this is very, very important, because what happens when I reading this is that when you are in one, he calls it one chapter, and then he reads, and then all of a sudden you get this line. It says like the body without organs, or the abstract machine, or something, some other concept that has been like developed in another place. And all of a sudden, when you read that line, like body without organs, all of a sudden I realized that this little line of text is actually a line of light. It actually transposes you into another plateau. It actually moves you away. It is a line of light that puts you away in another place in the book. And the whole book is this moving between this line of light between the different plateaus. And each plateau is this abstract machine working with some kind of polarity, some kind of binarity, and they're all like stacked together, and they're all like placed after each other, and they intertwine, and they all, like when you read the text, I like feel a sense that this is like you are inside some kind of this machine, this mechanosphere that is like you have to move through it. And when you're in this machine, you find yourself going in and out of different plateaus. So the whole book is this, the proof of his concept is a text in itself. That is it's part of the, you know, it's like the media is the message. It's part of what he's saying is how the book is written. And maybe that's the only thing he can do with his theory, in a sense, is to make this book. I don't know, but it's proof of point somehow, the way it's written. It's a proof of point of what it's saying. Do you agree?
Yeah, I get that for sure. I think that's what like all great philosophers do, is that their book itself is a practice in their theory. And it's definitely true of this text, that like they're trying to write in a way that is an embodiment of what is being written. Like the text itself is a message, but so too is the way that the text is put together. And the way you were talking about these lines of flight, I couldn't help but think of like hypertext and hyperlinks. And there's been way too much written about like the internet as rhizome, that is kind of iffy. But I think at least in terms of that sort of, we can think about these lines of flight is a sort of hypertext. Like when you see body without organs thrown about in one plateau, and you instantly have to go think about a different plateau, the body without organs plateau, and then you're in there and you get thrown into the nomadology plateaus, and let's say you're in the faciality plateau, but you don't actually learn what faciality is in the faciality plateau. You learn what it is in the regime of science plateau, which also draws heavily upon the postulate of linguistics. So it's like it's sort of like being on Wikipedia, right? And you'll just click something. You'll click a link to something else. And then you're in that sort of plateau. And then you click a new link on that plateau, and then you're in a different plateau. And then all of a sudden you're in a completely new thing that's completely unrelated to anything that you were at before, by means of these passages. And I think something similar happens here, that in following the connections, you go from one place to another, and it's hard to ever figure out where you may have been at the beginning. And in many ways, there's parts of the text that are like that, where they'll be talking about like Jean-Luc Godard, and then they'll be talking about biology or calculus in the next line, and you're like, what? How do these things function together? But there's like one line which produces a connection between those two things that allows them to just seamlessly go from this one thing to another. And you don't even recognize that jump is taking place when you're reading the text, right? You're just reading about Godard, and then you're learning about calculus. But it seems natural within the text itself. But if you look back, it's just like, well, how did we get from there to there? And it's only by this sort of connection, this act of creativity, that we can get from the one place to another.
When you talk about it using the analogy of Wikipedia, I get the picture also that you have this amazing function in Wikipedia called random page, where you can and I did it a while back. You can just press random page and just go into stuff like randomly and just see what happens, see what you learn. Just press the button and see where you go. But also is that there's something still with this randomness, and still with this, there's still this unifying beyond somewhere, that's because in some sense, I will now talk about the plane of consistency, that somehow everything holds together still. Like there's like the in the Wikipedia example, it's like you still have the somehow the something that is before the information. You have to have this this frame somehow that lets these kind of jumps, that allows the jump. You have to have this unified frame for allowing the jumps to occur. So and going back to the analogies, also like this is not a digital thing. This is like but he talks about something, I would say, analog, and something existential, because doing that internet thing is also like, this is before internet, and it's talking about something existential, something that happens in your thinking and in your life, which makes the analogy halt a bit, because this is much more closer to your own psyche, I would say. This is trying to map out your inner psyche and your inner structures, and also that when you talked about pressing a link and go a hyperlink, for me it's like the passing on from one page to the next page using the hyperlink. The passage there between is what he calls a becoming. That is the becoming somehow. That going between these plateaus or these stratas, there is like this becoming. So it's physical in some sense what he's talking about. I don't know where to go from there, but it's and I can't. That's hard for me, actually. That is one of my. It's like where, how does this tie into the factuality of existence? Like, so it not becomes a metaphor, but somehow factual. Maybe you can. What do you think?
So how does becoming, how is it factual?
Not factual, but I would say corporeal. corporeal, like something that has to do with my body, something that has to do with myself.
Right.
Situated somehow.
Well, I think that it is something that happens. I think the harder question would be, because I think that we're constantly becoming the any number of affections and perceptions, right? Any sort of thing that we're involved in, anything that we do affects us in a variety of ways. The much more difficult question is what role we play in determining that becoming, if any. And that's something that it's more a question of what sort of agency do we have in light of these becomings, which I think already assumes, like, begs a question of what are we, which I don't know how explicit Deleuze ever is on the I, but to me it seems most clearly that the I is simply an event for Deleuze. But it's not clear whether that I has any sort of agency in terms of conditioning these becomings in a particular way. Rather, what does have agency, if we want to call it agency, is the abstract machine, which is virtual and not actual. But it's this virtual consistency which diagrams the actual, but is also, my guess is that it's affected by the actual as well. So I read a little bit of Adkins' introduction to this book, a critical introduction to this book, and his hypothesis is that this is fundamentally a Spinozist book. And this is what he thinks. So Spinoza has the two attributes of substance, correct? He has extension and thought. Now, for Spinoza, extension and thought are independent of one another, but they are two attributes of understanding the same thing. So when we think something, or when we interact with its body, its extension, it's just different ways of interacting with, or it's different attributes of the same substance. So he sees that there is this sort of attribute relationship going on in this text as well. And I can't completely remember what he suggests are attributes, but it's not the virtual and the actual, because those would seem to be distinct. So he thinks content and expression are two attributes that, instead of being independent, intersect with one another. So extension interacts with content, and content interacts with expression, despite them being two separate attributes. But how does this relate to the virtual and the actual? I think that the molecular or content and the molar or expression, I think molarity is closer to the strata. So the more molar something gets, the more stratified and it becomes. Whereas the more molecular something is, the closer it is to the body without organs. Now, I still don't understand if there is a body without organs independent of the molecular, and I think there would be, because I think that there's a virtual that is distinct from this molecularity, or this molecular state, this smooth space, But I think the smooth space most closely resembles the plane of consistency, or the body without organs. And so in this way, if content and expression are simply two attributes of the same substance, then it would seem that if we prioritize content to expression, at least in certain certain instances, that this might be how it is possible to affect becoming in our own event, if that makes sense. So if we can focus on the molecular aspects, we can perhaps have some way of affecting the molar. The problem here is that we run into a sort of liberal Deleuzianism, which calls for just incremental, small-scale change, which is criticized by, say, like, I know Andrew Culp for sure is critical of this by suggesting that, like, that's not Deleuzian at all, because Deleuze wants a complete overthrow of the molar. So there's this tension here between whether it's simply this integral molecular change that has very subtle changes in the molar, or this complete negation of the molar for something completely different. And I'm not exactly sure where to play within that tension, but my sympathies lie closer to the complete deterritorialization of the molar.
I just wanted to say something. Hi. Are we discussing the final chapter today?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I think there are many Deleuze's, and that's part of why there's so many interpretations of Deleuze. You know, and one of those Deleuze's is sort of like the anti-Oedipus Deleuze. another one that's very, very different is the 1,000 Plateaus Deleuze. And the 1,000 Plateaus Deleuze, I think the anti-Oedipus Deleuze is calling for absolute deterritorialization, but I think that's pretty much accurate. But I'm not sure that's true for 1,000 Plateaus, because and this is actually where Nick Land criticizes 1,000 Plateaus, because he basically says that it was with 1,000 Plateaus that Deleuze and Guattari read Arendt. They read Arendt. They read Virilio. They read all these people, and you could look at Arendt and say that Arendt is a liberal, right? A lot of people say that. It's a common criticism. Zizek has denounced Arendt as a liberal, and said that her use of the word totalitarianism is an embarrassing concept because it conjoins fascism and communism. But the thing is that I think there are more possibilities than just liberal and radical. And one of the things that is said at the very end of the book in The Smooth and the Striated is never believe that a smooth space will save us. It's like a direct quote. Never believe that a smooth space will suffice to save us.
Yeah, that's the last line.
Yeah, we do need the striated to some degree, and I think that's because if you look at like my chapter in the Deleuze and Race book, one thing that I did is I tried to figure out where did they get this idea of the Urstadt, which is basically the eternal state, more or less, and so I found it in Georges Dumézil in his book Mitra Varuna, which is a really great book if you check it out. But basically what they say is that, and this is where a lot of like so-called liberal political theorists who use Deleuze, such as William Connolly, my dissertation advisor Michael J. Shapiro, and then a number of other people like that, they're sometimes denounced as liberal, but I think for the most part they're not actually liberals. They're really a kind of type 3 because what they're talking about is a sort of dialectic between deterritorialization and reterritorialization. So that basically you can think of it in like situationist terms when the situationists talk about recuperation, right? That anytime there's some form of resistance, eventually the system recuperates that resistance. So you could say DIY punk music or culture or kind of activist culture in the 90s where it was really emphasized they were going to be anti-corporate and have low prices for their records and things like that, or low prices to enter their shows and whatnot. That now that's basically been recuperated or reterritorialized in the form of social media where now everybody is DIY. And basically everybody is involved in something similar to a DIY culture. So it's been reterritorialized. And for Deleuze and Guattari, what I understand that to mean is basically that reterritorializing aspect of power is that is the Urstadt. That is the kind of eternal status tendency of human society that constantly, especially of those in power, but not just those in power, also those who seek power, are constantly sort of reterritorializing whatever has been deterritorialized. And so it's a kind of constant motion back and forth. And so as soon as something is reterritorialized, then there become new sort of nomadic forces that try to deterritorialize that. But then as soon as that happens, there's another reterritorialization. So I mean, you could think of it in terms of like, for example, the Spanish Civil War or the Russian Revolution. You could look at a lot of different events like that where, yes, there's this wonderful moment that happens, but then eventually something not so great happens, like Stalin, right? You could say that if we wanted to be really generous, we could even say that Lenin was in some ways deterritorializing, but that Stalin, less than a decade later, came in and reterritorialized all of the progress that had been made. And then on top of that, then capitalism came back in and reterritorialized all of that. So, not to mention the Orthodox Church and the way that the church and state began to work together to oppress various minorities and that kind of thing. So, I guess I'm just saying that I don't think it's quite accurate to call that liberal because I think that Land would agree with that, but that's a particular version of reading Deleuze that really emphasizes anti-Oedipus and really emphasizes the kind of like absolute deterritorialization over other forms. But that's the way that I look at it.
I agree with everything you say there, and it brings to mind how it's so dependent on how, like, if you see the text, that's this machine that has opened to many different inputs. It's so dependent on where you come from when you come to the text. And if you have this, maybe this youthful, naive worldview where you search for someone that will affirm what you're thinking,
right.
Then you will find it somehow, because you will be able to pick out those parts. And if you come from it from a very conservative point of view, then you also will be able to pick out those parts, because what at stake is here is a level below. It's not, it doesn't take stance in this question. It's trying to describe a mechanism below. So in the sense, you have to, it talks about, in the Creating a Body Without Organ chapter, is to create a plane of immanence with the charge of 0.
Right.
That you yourself has to charge yourself with 0 in order to experience these intensities in yourself. that is what's at stake here. It's not that it's trying to defend each of the positions, but that the abstract machine, or somehow that you talk, the ritualization and back and forth, it's something it's in a higher level somehow, something that continuously goes above us and through us, that we can learn how to experience these kinds of forces in our own immanence. And so when you go into the text, I think you should have this charging of zero, but also when we read the conclusion, when we leave the text, we should still have this charge of zero. we should not have been changed in that way. We should only have experienced intensities in a new way.
Yeah, I agree. That's interesting. But I mean, it's also interesting to read Deleuze from the perspective of absolute deterritorialization. It's just that I think that reading him that way is kind of a pre A Thousand Plateaus version. Because I think I think Land's right. I think they did sort of like alter their argument a bit. And I think the biggest reason that they altered their argument for A Thousand Plateaus is, I mean, he claims that it's because of Aurelio and Arendt, and he calls it the stinking relic of Judeo-Christian moralism. So I think he's implying that because Arendt is Jewish or something. I'm not really sure where the Judeo part comes in. The Christian part is definitely Aurelio that he's referring to. But I don't think that. I mean, it might be that it might be partially his Christianity that plays a role in the way that he kind of helps to temper their view of deterritorialization. But I personally think that the thing that makes A Thousand Plateaus really stand out differently from other texts is how relentlessly materialist it is. It's filled with examples, with like actual material examples, whether you're talking about a film or a novel or an artwork or whatever. But it also has a lot of science in it, you know, like the chapter on the refrain and on music. There's a lot of references to, you know, actual scientific research about bowerbirds, for example, the way that they become creative and construct houses and construct music almost in the way that humans would. And you don't really see that in A Thousand Plateaus as much, or sorry, in Anti-Oedipus and in other works, because a lot of the other works, I mean, you do, but not to the same degree. I feel like they really are doing something so different in A Thousand Plateaus. And for me, that's actually why it's my favorite book by him. And I don't know. I mean, Land might be right. It might have to do with Aurelio's Christianity to some degree, and maybe Arendt's Judaism. I don't know. What do you think?
See, I think the tension between the different deterritorializations and reterritorializations is something that's really interesting to me, because they're very explicitly against the negative deterritorialization in this book because of how dangerous it is, but they leave room for this positive absolute deterritorialization, which is, I think, much more difficult to get a hold of than this negative deterritorialization. And I think I like the argument you've made that that this is present from Deleuze's book on Nietzsche, where this sort of absolute deterritorialization is a yes which knows how to say no. And a really good example of this, I think, is in the book The Undercommons by Harney and Boughton, where one of them is they're talking about prison abolition. And they suggest that the problem with prison abolition is that its whole goal is just to get rid of prisons. And if you just get rid of prisons, you don't negate the space that exists that the prison function is.
Right.
And so what you ultimately get is sort of what Afro-pessimism has critiqued of the 1960s civil rights movement, that you get rid of that space for a time, but that space is ultimately re-territorialized through things like
You can go. Hello?
okay, like the new Jim Crow movement, where with the civil rights movement, you had all of these rights and privileges restored or given to people who didn't have them before. But 20 years later, those very people are really affected in the same ways, just with a difference through the mass incarceration of Black people. And I think that when they talk about the change in how we discuss prison abolition, the goal should not simply be to negate the prison structure, but to create a new structure where the prison structure isn't even possible anymore. That the absolute deterritorialization of the prison requires a positive reterritorialization in the form of an affirmation which creates new conditions which don't even allow the possibility of the prison to exist anymore. And like, I think that's what the absolute deterritorialization is. But the struggle for me is to see how such a deterritorialization could be absolute, I guess. That's a struggle I have. Because that deterritorialization is already working within the conditions of what came before. So it's hard to see how it's anything other, how it isn't simply relative. But perhaps this is a misunderstanding on my part of the absoluteness of the absolute.
We've been talking a lot about this question during the readings, but I just jumped on the idea there that somehow there was a change, and I wanted to ask the question back, that there was a change with the Deleuze encounter with Virilio between Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, and that's part of this caution that is entered, this more mature view on the question, like something not a I wouldn't use the word conservative, but somehow this caution, this we're dealing with something that we have to be cautionate about. Would you say it's a Virillian thing, that is part of the encounter with Virilio?
I think so. So I'm not sure exactly what Virilio they read in between those years. They're for sure, they're like Deleuze and Guattari were friends with Virilio, so I'm sure they had many conversations. But Virilio's whole shtick is speed, right? Have you read any Virilio?
Only small parts, not large parts.
So Virilio talks a lot about speed and the way that speed functions as a way of control. So he talks about how the speed that we can send nuclear weapons during World War II fundamentally shapes the way that we interact with the world. So mutually assured destruction leaves us all in like a perpetual state of total war, which he calls pure war, where where in the past war has been an external feature, today war is endocolonial. It's an internal colonization. And he also talks about just what I think they really get from Virilio is this idea of the mastery of speeds. So I think in Anti-Oedipus, there's really this desire to go faster, to accelerate the process towards the destruction of capitalism. Right? The point is not to stop the flow of capitalism; it's to accelerate the process. Whereas in 1,000 Plateaus, they're more cautious because they're like, if we accelerate the process, that's going to lead us back to fascism. And I think that's what they get from Virilio, this idea that just this pure acceleration doesn't get you anywhere. You need to control the speeds in order to produce a positive change that doesn't simply return to fascism.
I think that's part of it's answering the question, because I will now refer to the Sloterdijk here also about the aesthetic discipline that he picks up from Nietzsche, and that's also present somewhere. And you said it was a mastery of speeds. That means it's like, in the end, it's also like a techne. It's a techne of life. It's somehow a mastery of living. It goes into something very. It ties into what Sloterdijk called the eschatology, that how to develop by asceticism, and that all Western and all religions have these types of ideas. And I sense that because one of the things I constantly encountered was this whole notion of to be able to do this, you need to it requires a lot of sobriety. It requires, like, he pushes up speed, but then he's like slows it down. He said, like, to master this, you need sobriety. You need to lodge yourself onto a stratum and so on. That it's in the text, it kind of pops up some places, this techniques of living, this ars morendi. No, morendi is the dying, but to live this art form of living. And I think that there is something very existential to the text and to this as you can also read it as wisdom somehow, life wisdom, and therefore, but it's in a very, very new type of language that ties into a lot of modernities and postmodernities vocabulary. I don't know if you agree, maybe.
I definitely agree with the sort of there's this, I hate that word, asceticism, aesthetic thing going on. It goes into like their discussion of drugs, right? You have to control the speeds, your own speeds, to get drunk on water. Yeah, it's definitely against this pure sort of just blitzing fastness, just absolute. Jason, I can't remember which of the you distinguish between speed and acceleration at some in some paper you make that distinction.
Well, actually, Chernyshek and Williams make the distinction, and they say that and they say that speed is, I think they're responding to Land's critique of 1,000 Plateaus as being Judeo-Christian moralism, because what they say is, they say that speed is what Land kind of celebrates, and the problem with just pure speed is it's not selective. it's not a selective way of engaging material reality. It just sort of it's just, you know, like now there's on the internet there's, you know, the unconditional accelerationists, and I think that that concept of unconditional is kind of what they were critiquing, where it's just sort of almost like nihilism, just, you know, go as fast as possible and let deterritorialization go wherever it may go. Whereas acceleration, they frame acceleration as basically speed with a steering wheel, more or less, is one way to think about it. And so acceleration means that that you're sort of somewhat more deliberately trying to move experimentally. For example, experiment with universal basic income, or experiment with automation that would actually benefit society rather than just benefiting corporations, or experiment with various things like that. Whereas speed is unselective. It doesn't really have a direction per se, and it's just sort of like speed for speed's sake. And so I think that's the main difference there. And to some degree, I think that we could say that Land is not entirely incorrect about Virilio, because I mean, he is influenced by Christianity for sure. So I think that for Virilio's critique of speed, part of what the question that he's raising is you know, is it really beneficial to humanity, which he would consider to be, you know, God's creation? So is it really beneficial to humanity to just sort of relentlessly let all forms of technological development and sort of hyper acceleration, such as modifying the human body through genetic engineering or through bioengineering, is that really beneficial, and is that really something we want? And maybe sometimes we do want that. And I think that Virilio isn't necessarily opposed to techno-scientific development, as long as it's something that we've decided democratically that we actually want. You know, like, do we really want nuclear weapons and nuclear power, for example? I think for Virilio, he'd probably say no, and he'd probably hope that like Deleuze and Guattari's take on that would not necessarily celebrate that, at least in 1,000 Plateaus. And to some degree, Land may be right that might come from his Christianity to a degree.
I think it's really interesting and very good distinction between speed and acceleration. And I think that when Deleuze is using speed, it's almost, as I remember, in connection with the plane of consistency, that somehow there is this plane of consistency, speed somehow, but as soon as you have stratified, you're somehow working within a stratified context. And as you mentioned, like speed with the steering wheel, is that there's also one line somewhere, as what I was thinking about, is that I think it's when you create the plane of immanence, it says that you can either like go faster, but you can also slow down, and you can also stand still. It's also a way of becoming. Mm-hmm. So because if you have there's the gas, but there's also the brake, and the brake can also be a way of becoming. So it opens up a spectrum that you have to be open to, which is kind of, so you can, and that ties into the aesthetic endeavor somehow, that you can also, in a sense, reject something to become something else. That the no can also be a tool in a becoming.
Yeah.
But you have to steer this. That there's no such thing as you mentioned some, I don't know what that is, but unconditional accelerationism. That is like, but that's simplifying what's at stake here, because the question is, and we discussed this, Jacob, the agency is that like the question bounces back to oneself, is that you still somehow have to be the one behind the steering wheel somehow. You still have to make the decisions yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's telling in terms of the standing still that they choose the nomad, because at one point they quote Toynbee, Tony B. I don't know how to say the person's name, but they say that the nomad is the one who moves without moving. That the nomad stays in one place. That they're able to change without. I can't remember the entire quote, but I'm going to look it up. It's in one of the nomadology plateaus. But ultimately, that the nomad doesn't move, that the nomad stays in one place. And I think that is something that can easily be missed by thinking that the nomad is somebody who moves from place to place, depending on a whole bunch of various factors. But the nomad stands still, which is really interesting. And I think Virilio says something about that as well at some point, in terms of I think Virilio talks about it in terms of the media making it possible to go all over the world without moving, but I'm not sure how much that relates.
Yeah. Yeah, his whole thing on Virilio's whole thing on like distance pollution, and I forget the term he uses for it, but basically we're becoming sort of immobilized in electronic cocoons in a way, in the sense that like, in the past, if we all three wanted to have a conversation, we would have to all, go to the same place physically. But now, but I mean, already with telephones, you could do that. But now, especially with like Hangouts, you can really do it. You can really conjoin totally different places from around the world into one virtual place, which means that the body is moving less. The body doesn't have to move, and it becomes immobilized. But even though it's immobilized, from a Deleuze-Guattarian perspective, it is actually more nomadic in many respects. Like in the past, for example, like I grew up partially in the punk scene in the 90s, and at that time there was everything was physical. There was basically no internet presence that aided it, because this was like the early 90s, and as a result of that, when you were part of a subculture, you were fully part of that subculture, and you might listen a little bit to other subcultures' music, but not much. Whereas today, we see subcultures are kind of post-subcultural, and I think that the reason that society has become post-subcultural, in the sense that, like, if you ask somebody, "Oh, what kind of music do you like?" almost everybody will say, "I like everything." I like, and then they'll list like 10 things that they like, or 10 genres that they like. Whereas in the past, people really strongly identified with a particular genre, and that was like almost all encompassing of their sense of self and their self identity. And you could say that that's partially because we have, everyone has become much more nomadic because of like Wikipedia, because of Spotify, because of all of these different things. If you hear about a new music genre, you can just go look at Wikipedia, find out who all the top kind of figures are in that field, and just go listen to all those really in just one day, and then, the next day you might be into some other genre. So we're kind of like immobilized, and we're physically staying in the same place. We're not necessarily going to go hang out with the other people in our subculture per se, but instead we're although that does happen, but I mean, most people are listening to like a wide variety of genres, and don't really confine themselves to one identity per se. And you could say that that's an effect of the internet and of speed, increased speed of information, increased variety of information, that's accessible to everybody like instantaneously.
I'll continue on that note, and I will say that this is also a problem that actually Kierkegaard was heavily thinking about. He and when they reference Kierkegaard in 1000 Plateaux, it is because he says that it talks about the night of fate, and the night of fate is a bourgeoisie, someone that you cannot see on the outside. He lives his normal life, yet he is a knight of faith, because he is in a sense, he is in dialogue with something beyond himself that no one else can see. And because he was like one of the first to experience the newspapers and think about the newspapers, and also, you know, like what we talk about now, that you said that distance over telephone, but even with the books, like it's also communication over distance. Like this is the first step. It's like to read a book is to have a dialogue with someone that is not there.
Yeah.
And in a sense that I think for Kierkegaard, even praying is the most basic form of having a dialogue with someone that is not there.
Right.
But you can stand still, yet, and I would say that the ultimate form here is prayer. But you can still be in full acceleration somehow. You can still be in movement. And the Knight of Faith is movement in stillness. He has learned to master the speeds, but it's not something that. But he's not someone that you can see on his clothes or what he wears. It's an internal process. He works with his internal speeds in ways that other people maybe don't. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I mean, just the invention of the printing press, you know, where Benedict Anderson talks about, Benedict Anderson talks about how the printing press made it possible, is along with like telegraphs and kind of old communication technologies, early ones, made it possible to communicate across long distances. And so that also could be a form of nomadism there. You could even say that nation states, even though we might not like nation states, but compared to prior forms of sort of tribal belonging prior to the nation state, or just other forms of like pre-nation state forms of belonging, which were sometimes like empires and things like that. Nation states conjoined, if you think about it, they conjoined totally different peoples into one unit. If Anderson is right, that the reason that happened is that the printing press and the telegraph made long distance communication possible across vast territories, then you could say that even nation states are, at least compared to what existed before, they are deterritorializations of prior forms of political community and like cultural belonging. But they will surely, and already are, being deterritorialized now. You look at like the depending on what you believe about Russian intervention in the U.S. election, if all of that is true, or if even part of it is true, then the way that happened is through hacking, right? Like long distance hacking, long distance political subversive advertising, and happening over the internet. So already the internet is disrupting like very important elections, you know. So you could say the same effect that the printing press had and the telegraph had in the creation of the nation state is now having the opposite effect in terms of the internet and the ability to interfere with elections internationally. Which may cause serious problems for the nation state system at some point. And that might be an example of where where like the smooth and the striated, like when he says that never believe that a smooth space will suffice to save us. That might be one example of that. You know, like for example, like, you know, Russia meddling in the U.S. election, potentially contributing to bringing Trump to power. In some ways that is the act of, you know, that's the act of a sovereign nation state. and but it's interfering in the affairs of another nation state, just like the U.S. has done for like a century or longer in Latin America and around the world. But you could say that that the effect of that is even though it is coming from a striated space, like the Russian sovereignty, Russian sovereign power, is definitely a striated space rather than a smooth space, but it's still totally disrupting what was already the norm in a way.
I will continue on this speed, and I will use the Swedish current state as an example. I listened to a discussion yesterday about where we said that the thing that we had in Sweden was a democracy. We used to say, or we have a democracy that was based on the slowness. That change was something that if you had an opinion, it had to go through certain stages to so you could write a letter to you have it the same, but I will use Sweden. But so you could have an opinion, you could go to your representative, and they could go further, and they can take it on. So your opinions was something that was slowed down in a sense, and that therefore it could be manageable. What has happened now, and it has happened to you too, is that the rise of the internet has given there's no friction in the transference of opinions. You can actually say what you think, and it just pops out. You can publish it. Yeah. So therefore, actually, the opinions has always been there. Maybe it has just been slowed down by the system. The system very few opinions could like have the intensity of breaking through. But you always had this kind of small opinions everywhere, but it was facilitated by representatives, and then it goes up the system. But now, yes, what has always been there is nothing has changed here. It's just that the speeds has now like come up to the surface. So it's just like this kind of, and now it's once again, how then do you control these speeds? That is the next question. When you have unleashed something, this informational speed, where do you go from there? And that's where we are, like today, because you have entered into a new kind of ecosystem where there is no friction. The friction of writing and the friction of representation is eliminated. And I think that like this is what is interesting with the reading of 1,000 Plateaus in this context is that I don't see that there is an answer here in this book. Like this is not where you find the answer. It's very hard to like use these for some kind of political movement. It eludes you. Like when you try to, it's like sand that when you try to take hold of it, it like goes through your fingers, so it evaporates somehow. So it's only kind of. So it can only like give you maybe a language, but I don't know if that's the correct language. But it can like tell you what's happening, but it cannot save you. Like this, the smooth space cannot save you. Was the quote right? Like there's nothing that can save you here. We can only see it, and you can only like learn to experience these kind of no modes and see what's happening in the future. Yeah.
I think that the political example gives a really good insight into both the danger and the hope that exists sort of within the smooth space, because these increasing speeds of like individual opinions allow for both those with opinions we would agree with and those that we find very dangerous to sort of rise up to the surface and erupt in ways that were much harder to produce. It was much harder to cross that sort of threshold where they became a threat in the past. But today, with this mass communication and the ability to connect with people who you wouldn't have connected with before, right? because on the telephone, you're probably only going to talk to people that you have some sort of connection with. With the internet, you can have these chat rooms where you're communicating with strangers that you would have had no connection with in the era of the telephone. And so people with seemingly very small, like, individual opinions can communicate with people all over the globe or the country who have very similar opinions to them, which allows things like the alt-right or whatever to take place in ways that they might not have been able to take place 25 years ago. But it also allows something like Bernie Sanders to take place, or the rise of the DSA post-Trump to take place, which may not have been possible prior to that. So this sort of smooth space, this disruption that can take place on a molecular political level, but can cross that threshold into more of the molar, large-scale level, is possible on all sides of the spectrum, and can be very dangerous and lead to something more akin to fascism, or it could lead to something constructive and, I don't know, emancipatory.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the way to use, if you remember at the very beginning, isn't that this is the book where Foucault introduces it and says it's a guide to anti-fascism? Doesn't he say that?
He says that he writes the introduction to Anti-Oedipus.
Oh, right. Okay, that's right. Yeah, I was confused. Yeah, a guide to the non-fascist life. But I do think it's politically useful. I mean, I think it is sort of like sand, precisely because of the fact that not only, I mean, like Anti-Oedipus almost offers a more direct line about what should be done, you know, in a way. And I agree that it is sort of like sand politically, but on the other hand, I think if you read, like, I think the most important political theorist to interpret Deleuze and to apply it politically is William Connolly. And if you read his work, he cites Deleuze all over the place. He's considered to be the most important American political theorist around, pretty much. I mean, at least within, you know, continentally influenced political theory. And his politics, like kind of what he gets from Deleuze, he has a book called The Ethos of Pluralization. And so that, like, just two examples that he takes from Deleuze politically, and that I think are very much indebted to A Thousand Plateaus. Like, when I was in grad school, I was in a political theory department, and A Thousand Plateaus was the go-to book, more than any other book by Deleuze, for political theory. And the reason was two reasons. So two concepts that Connolly draws from them. One of them is ontopolitics. So ontopolitics is basically the idea that any assertion of what the basic categories of being are, you know, the idea, like, say, for example, that some people will assert that that you know, that race is real, and that there are, like, you know, 5 distinct races throughout humanity, and that's it, right? Or other people will say that there are only 2 genders, and that's it. So to assert that there's only 5 races or only 2 genders is on an ontological level is an assertion of it's kind of it's an ontopolitical assertion, because you can't just say that without having underlying political assumptions behind it. And we can see that in all of those cases that it's a hotly contested topic whether that's actually true or whether it's not actually true. So that's also ontopolitics. And I think that you can kind of see that in sort of the idea of the nomad and some of the other concepts in this book. But really the most important one is the ethos of pluralization, which I think kind of goes along with this idea of the smooth and the striated, that never believe that a smooth space will suffice to save us. But at the same time, you know, we also have to fight for the the kind of freedom and equality of like already existing minorities. But the issue is that existing minorities often themselves become conservative. You know, like once they've been accepted, they start to say, like, for example, sometimes there are Latin Americans who are naturalized citizens of the U.S. And if you ask them what they think about immigration, sometimes they will actually be anti-immigration, even though they're Latino American, because they think that only their own process of becoming citizens is legitimate, and that people who are crossing the border illegally are illegitimate. So this conservative part comes in. So the ethos of pluralization basically says that we should be constantly looking for new claims to belonging, to like belonging, and trying to open up our definition of whatever the group is, say like U.S. citizens, that we should be trying to open up and pluralize what we consider to be us, you know, in a way. So the ethos of pluralization, I think, is like one way that you could take 1,000 Plateaus in a political direction. And in some ways, it might seem like not as revolutionary or radical as, say, like a Marxist or anarchist overthrow of the state or of capitalism. But I think that what 1,000 Plateaus suggests is something like an ethos of pluralization that would eventually disrupt capitalism and would eventually disrupt the state as well. Because if you continue to constantly pluralize and constantly break up various forms of homogeneity, including new forms, like, for example, gay marriage. Like now, gay marriage is legal, but there are still people who are not able to marry in the way that they would prefer to marry. So then the question is, are gay people are people in the LGBT community going to be supportive of the demands of other people to be able to marry, or are they just going to celebrate their own right to marry now that they've achieved it? So I think that's one way that 1,000 Plateaus could be used politically.
I think about the distinction made somewhere in the text between the private thinker and the public thinker.
Yeah.
And in the sense that it's for me, when I come to the text, I come to it as a private thinker. Like this is, first of all, I lock myself in and I just feel it, and I don't try to apply it. I don't look for an application. I just trying to experience it. But as soon as you are going out with like this, when you experience this openness and this kind of deterritorialization of oneself and so on, but as soon as you kind of like step out through the door and start to trying to implement these kinds of ideas, there's somehow like a gap that opens, and you become enmeshed in so much other like stuff that and when you quote thinkers that apply the laws, I also assume that they have a lot of else going on, like they have their own intellectual machine where they like plunge this in somehow in order for their machine to work better. It's like they have this machine that they are trying to, and then they plunge it in, and then they use different parts to build this. So I can see that, but and that's also one of the points, I think, with this text, is to make new assemblages. But there's such a multiplicity of assemblages possible on this level that you always have to compromise all the other assemblages somehow, and it's impossible in a sense for me just to like I also, and one of the things we were trying to do was, I asked the question in the Facebook page was like, where do we go from here with the text? Like, how do we implement this in our own assemblages? Because we cannot like take this as it is. Like we cannot take this. We have to see, in a sense, like where do we come from, and what other types of thinkers, types of feelings, and how can this like plunge into it? And one of the main like ideas I've been having during this reading is that how you can use 1,000 plateaus actually as a translating device between different assemblages.
Yeah.
And that's very, very powerful. Like if you're very honest with your assemblages, like this is where I came from, and you are very honest with yours, maybe we can find this third language that we are able to communicate through. And I think you can have a lot of very interesting dialogues going through this kind of medium, because it gives you a kind of third languages where you none of us can say like we accept it at fully at face value, but we can say like this is my assemblages, and this is the parts that I connect to. And then you can go like a rhizomatic line through this, and we can like have this kind of dialogue to the third party. That's more of
I was just going to say, this assemblage topic is another place that William Connolly addresses in a super interesting way in this very short essay called Assembling the Left. And in Assembling the Left, he basically rejects the, basically what happened is that, I think it was Wendy Brown. No, it wasn't Wendy Brown. It was, who was it? I'm trying to remember. It was some like Marxist feminist thinker from the New School for Social Research. I can't remember her name right now. Nancy, I'll think of it in a minute. But basically what she argued is that she kind of argued against identity politics and for economically focused politics in a kind of sort of typical Marxist fashion. And he responded using this idea of an assemblage and said, well, the problem with a purely class politics being opposed to identity politics is that then you create this like strict bifurcation between class politics and like identity categories, when actually if you look at the history of a lot of movements basically from the 90s through the present, it really has been based on assemblages, and so he calls for he points out that the right wing has been very good at creating what he calls resonant machinic assemblages. So, for example, on the right, somehow everything from Nazis to literal neo-Nazis to alt-right to kind of run-of-the-mill conservatives to wealthy Republicans, all of them, and then to like evangelical right-wing forms of evangelicalism and things like that. All of them have found ways that even though they're entering the field of the right from like many completely different perspectives, they still create this resonant machinic assemblage together, and it somehow works, and they somehow succeed to push politics further and further to the right. And he says that they don't do that on the basis of homogeneity. They do it on the basis of heterogeneity and of accepting different forms of right-wing politics and allowing them to all kind of like work together. Whereas the left tends to become very split, and people break into factions and they won't work together. They won't, for example, one thing he talks about is he has a book called Why I'm Not a Secularist. So he talks about religion, and he says that when you look back at the civil rights movement, there really was a left machinic assemblage that happened in the U.S. Between churches, specifically black churches, between white allies, between lawmakers, between musicians, people who work in the culture industry, between academics. I mean, between a very, very wide field of people who are placed very differently in society, very much like what the right wing does now, where you can have anything from neo-Nazis to just moderate Republicans, all kind of working together. But the left seems to not be able to do that. So he pointed out that that the argument made against identity politics is just another example of really just another example of the left refusing to create this machinic assemblage that we actually need if we're gonna win. So that's another way that I think 1,000 Plateaus can be useful politically. But I think we're starting to see that happen with like DSA, you know, like DSA includes under its fold everything from, you know, anarcho-syndicalists to, you know, kind of like progressive Democrats, really. Everything, like a very wide spectrum, are under its fold. So I think that's really exciting and encouraging, personally. And I think it really matches this idea of a machinic assemblage, of a political machinic assemblage.
Yeah, it would seem that the tension within something like DSA is the goal of keeping these things in balance, right?
Yeah.
And not producing a new sort of molar reterritorialization that takes over the institution.
Right. Yeah. Although it does have its factions within it that would love to take it over.
Right. Yeah, and you just got to keep those in tension with each other, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a fine sort of line to balance.
Yes.
But like the DSA, like, so just thinking about it within my local context, like the DSA is so much more successful than there's basically no anarchist groups, like actively political anarchist groups, and the Marxist-Leninists, the prominent Marxist-Leninist groups, they're very, very tiny. But the DSA has been able to, they have like multiple candidates running in the next election. They have many events that are better attended than the events of the Marxist-Leninists, for sure. And so it's definitely a step in a positive direction, in my opinion.
You know, I'm Swedish. You know, we have like socialism in our blood. So this is like we have so much more. I'm used to like we are used to a majority of socialists here, and we're witnessing exactly this kind of inability to make an alliance with difference, and this kind of they always get stuck in this kind of purity discussions, and we're seeing like this the unableness to vibrate with the people. Actually, the left has lost contact in Sweden with the people and has become like what they call a political correct elite and so on, and the right wing is nowadays a much more vital and very much more technical, very much more, many more channels connecting the people, very much more different groups. A lot of immigrants and right-wing people are like forging alliances in very, very strange alliances. So the only ones like critiquing the government now are women and immigrants because they have become like the new voice for anti-government. So it's very interesting, these kinds of I will continue to think about that this assemblage and because but what I'm thinking about is that you can say that you're an assemblage, but somehow that one of the questions that they also grapples with is like how to make something. What is it that makes it vibrate together? What is it that is in between that makes something vibrate together? What is this something that makes disparate things able to vibrate? Because somehow it has to vibrate. It has to be connected in some sense to this plane of consistency in a same kind of way. It has to go like deep and connect and go up again. It has to have the roots somewhere, so that in the strata the expression is different. But since it is like deeply connected through this becoming to a deeper level, it is able that at a higher level to vibrate together. So you have to reach like if you're searching for to vibrate with someone at the same strata as you have to go to deeper strata somehow. You have to resonate at a deeper level to be able to work as an assemblage on this strata. This is that's you have to become something else in order to work together. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. It's like there's a particular assemblage with all these disparate parts, but there has to be a certain way of resonating those different parts along the same sort of frequency in order to actualize the diagram put forward by some sort of abstract machine, which is in constant relation with the current state of the assemblage. But in order to produce a becoming and push through the threshold into a new assemblage, there has to be this sort of resonance between the various factions that allow it to produce or become that new sort of assemblage. So I think what I'm trying to say is that within the contemporary assemblage, you have to be able to produce the right sort of frequencies to allow for the potential of that goal of that to get the new assemblage. The potential for it is alive in the current assemblage, and somehow this maps on to the concept of the abstract machine, I think. But the virtual of the future is in some way contained in the contemporary.
I have to just jump in because they make in this chapter we read now, the postulates of linguistics. He takes up the question about Lenin, and what Lenin does when he says workers of the world unite, is that he calls it a master word, I think, but he creates that kind of a master signifier. And he also uses a very interesting example is that when you are on a plane and someone is raising up and saying, this is a hijacking, all of a sudden the peoples in the plane are now hijacked. They are now an assemblage. That somehow the language of the situation is, and he's very technical about how this is done, but somehow a new type of organization or new kind of state somehow is like entering into reality by the expression. In this sense, you're hijacked or workers of the world unite. is that it creates a new type of entity somehow that you have to articulate, you have to express it, and in the expression something happens. So you always have to like, and you have to have this, and that was what I say, like what is it that ties together the disparate somehow, is that you have to insert, in this sense you have to insert the power word, to be able to do that. I don't have any answer more than so.
Well,
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
I think the concept of the statement, which I believe they get from Foucault, is really interesting in thinking through the pushing through the threshold in terms of like actual virtual distinction. And I think the hijacking is example, to use the hijacking example, the current assemblage, before pushing through that threshold, needs to have that virtual potential to actualize into the hijacking scenario, right? You can't just, if you're in a sea of people, you can't just go, I'm hijacking this sea of people. You need a particular potential available in the assemblage that you're currently in order to actualize that virtual potential through the statement, I'm hijacking this plane. So the current assemblage so to pass through that threshold, that potential needs to be there in the current assemblage. I think that's helpful. The statement is actually quite helpful there.
One thing that Connolly argues is he has a book called Pluralism. All of his political theory in the last 2 decades are extremely indebted to Deleuze. And in his book Pluralism, he says that the thing that allows for resonant assemblages to vibrate is that everyone has to fold a degree of contestability into their own position, whatever that position is. Whatever your argument is, you have to you have to basically like admit that you might be somewhat wrong, and so in doing that, that opens you to the other to some degree, at least a degree of contestability. So if you have that, like let's just say with his example that he was talking about is religious fundamentalism. So he's arguing that part of what a left assemblage needs is that it needs multiple forms of faith to be able to kind of resonate on like an interfaith level in terms of religion. And he was writing not long after 9/11 when there was a lot of focus on kind of Islamic fundamentalism and that kind of thing when he wrote that book. And so he focused on lots of examples of different forms of Islam that do in fact do that, and that are not fundamentalist in the sense that they are able to find points of resonance with other types of faith, and also he also points to different forms of Christianity that are able to do that as well. But you could say the same thing politically within DSA. I mean, to bring together like there's like an anarcho-syndicalist group within DSA that's officially recognized by DSA. So they actually have explicit anarchists amongst their number, and then they also have like Trotskyists. They also have Leninists. They also have progressive Democrats who are actually pretty much pro-capitalist, but they just believe in social democracy, social democrats. So they have everything. They have all of these different positions that are within it, and I think that the thing that allows it to resonate is that each person, in deciding to become part of DSA, actually each individual person, not just the positions themselves, but each individual person recognizes that there is a greater good in becoming part of this larger thing. and it kind of implies that like the internal concept of one's own position is to some degree contestable. You know, like you might have a position, but about what should happen and what the strategy should be and that sort of thing, but your own position is contestable. You might hear somebody else within something like DSA who has a different idea, and you might find that you agree with that kind of thing. But that's where resonance comes from, is internal contestability, and admitting that you could be wrong, basically.
It's very interesting. I will take this a step further, and I will use the example of Christianity and the notion of you have to accept that you're a sinner in order to become a part of the body of Christ.
Right.
So you have to somehow, you unless you have this baptismal rite, this purification rite. But what happens in this rite is that your body then becomes a part of a larger body. You become you become an organ in this larger body. But you still somehow, so you kind of open yourself up to, you find in a sense like that you contest, that is like you contest something in yourself, but that becomes an opening, and it opens up, because as I see it is that somehow you become part of a machine or a body that is larger than yourself. So somehow you become, a lot of Deleuzian becoming is like, as we talked before, like you become, it's downwards becoming. It's becoming like of the woman and the child, and downwards and the animal, and so on, down to the plane of consistency. For me, it's and you did vertigo, like you look downwards, but there's actually no upward in Deleuze. There's nothing upwards, that you can like become something larger than yourself. And this is also Sloterdijk, actually, the somehow the ladder between from below to above, so to speak. But in the political sphere also, is that like to become a political body then is to renounce something of your own sovereignty in order to become a part of a larger political body. So the same kind of logic is at stake in both types of. The question is like maybe more on the detailed technical level, like how do you define your own fault, or how do you define? Yeah, now you're gone. But I was saying that it works on many different ways, these kinds of questions. Your turn, Jacob. Say something.
I didn't realize I was muted. I don't know. There's a lot to think about right now. I have one more question, I guess, before we close, and we should probably close pretty soon. We've been going for quite a while. And this is just a question of, would you do the order differently in rereading the book? Like, one thing I for sure think I would do is, and it was a little limited by the 8-week structure, which I could which plateaus I would put together. But the one thing I for sure would change would be to read the postulate of linguistics before the regime of signs and the faciality plateau. But beyond that, I'm not sure what order I would recommend the book be read in. I think most of it I really liked the ordering, but that for sure I would have done differently.
I think it was majority of the readings.
I'm gonna have to go. I'm really sorry.
Oh, that's fine. We were like kind of concluding anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
I can just end by saying I would say that the majority of the readings were very good, and the majority of them actually connected. I would say, maybe there were one or two, but I can't think of now. And it was really good to read "Becoming Animal" as one because that is so dense, actually.
Yeah.
I would, maybe read the conclusion in the middle.
All right. Well, thank you, Jason, for hosting us all of these weeks. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite books of all time. So if you ever want to do if you ever want to do In Search of Lost Time by Proust, let me know.
All right.
that's another favorite. But yeah, this book is just so important. It's really, really important book. And nowadays it's kind of overlooked because everybody reads Anti-Oedipus instead. But I think this one is far more refined, far more materialist, far more relevant, to be honest.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'll see you when I see you. Bye, everybody.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.